This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by the Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights, Rachel Pulfer. Thanks so much for joining me, Rachel.
It's a pleasure to be here, Teresa. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
So, before we really dive into everything, I want to talk a little bit about your organization, Journalists for Human Rights. Can you talk about what the organization does and how that translates to your day-to-day work?
Absolutely. Journalists for Human Rights is what's called a media development organization. And what that means is that we support journalists in doing their jobs worldwide. It means support for training, for capacity building, networking, some grants, as well as advocacy when journalists are being targeted, where they're in danger, and in environments where press freedom is under attack. We do this work all over the global majority, also with journalists in exile across Europe and also in Canada. In Canada, our focus currently is support for journalists in exile, as well as building pathways to journalism for underrepresented groups, such as BIPOC groups and LGBTQI+. Globally, we work across 16 countries. These include Mali, South Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, Tunisia, Morocco, Kenya, with the Somali community in Kenya and Uganda, and in the Philippines. To answer your day-to-day question, what this means is training, workshops, capacity building, mentorship, providing grants, doing networking work so that journalists can work together effectively and well in the face of common threats. It also means addressing relationships and building relationships with civil society actors to create effective movements for change. And crucially, it means work on what we like to call an enabling environment for journalism. And what this means is work with both civil society and with government, championing the interests of journalists, helping to both civil society and government understand why a free press is so important to their respective spheres, and also to make sure that press freedom issues are on the front burner. What sets us apart from some other organizations that do this kind of work is that we very, very, very strongly believe in working with and through networks of local journalists in a very decentralized way. We do this because we believe that local voices matter, that they are the most credible when it comes to addressing some of the topics that we're engaging them on in these different contexts, and that's the kind of work that we want to amplify. But we do very strongly believe that a free press is bedrock for a functioning democracy. There is no accountability without strong journalism.
I could not agree more. I'm wondering if you can give our listeners a background of your own path to JHR. How did you get involved in the first place?
Oh, sure. So I was a child of development. My parents both worked in international development. And so I grew up in places like Eswatini and in Lesotho during apartheid. So my father was working on clean technology programming and biogas programming in Lesotho in the early 80s, before clean technology was even a thing. He was helping to power villages through the cultivation of biogas from manure. He was known locally as Dr. Shit in the various valleys of Lesotho. We also lived in Papua New Guinea, where my father was working on antiretroviral treatments for HIV. And so I had a front seat view of the world of international development, both its pleasures and its pains, in terms of seeing some programming that was really not that smart, dreamed up in other parts of the world. That's why I have such a strong commitment to decentralizing and localizing wherever we can. But I also saw that journalism could be a really important agent of change in environments where there was so little accountability for the people on the ground. Often the governments were elite and dysfunctional. In many cases, we'd had local people taking over formal colonial apparatuses that were designed to extract wealth from those environments, not to serve the interests of constituents. And lo and behold, post-colonial, they just kept on extracting wealth and not necessarily reinvesting in society. Journalism could cut that cycle and cut through that cycle and ensure that people had a chance to voice their concerns, to ensure that their issues were being raised in ways that mattered to them, in ways that helped to either encourage, in some contexts, or force in others, governments to take action to support their constituents. And that was very much work that I wanted to get behind. I had trained as a journalist and worked as a journalist in Canada for a variety of news organizations, and then I was very fortunate in doing a Massey Fellowship that gave me some time to reflect on my career to date. I'd done a lot of business reporting, which was interesting, but not the kind of accountability, human rights type work that I was really motivated by. And then an opportunity came along to become the programs director at Journalists for Human Rights, and I jumped at it, and it's been JHR ever since.
I think that's a really good background to sort of launch into some of the issues that journalism is facing today, because you've seen a lot of them along the way, of course. So you talked a lot about the power of journalism to hold governments to account, which is something that I've been on the government side. I've always, respected the journalists that I've worked with on that side. We've had good relationships because I know that they are an important part of our functioning democracy, as you said. Mm-hmm. But that part of our democracy is increasingly under attack from the side that I was on, from government, from the political side of it. And, we've been dealing with, for about 10 years now, this idea of fake news and that journalism is propaganda and all of this kind of stuff. How is that narrative starting to impact our political climate and journalists' ability to actually hold governments to account?
Well, we're seeing it everywhere we work, including in this country. Fake news rhetoric, as you say, it's a deliberate tactic to erode public trust in journalism. And it's the first tool in the autocrat's playbook. If people are more inclined to believe the autocrat and his version of events than the journalist, then the autocrat is free to make up his own facts about an issue and easily sideline facts that are inconvenient to that narrative in ways that actually disempower people. But when people distrust the press, governments then can get away with less scrutiny, less accountability, and are able to repress reporting with greater impunity. What we also see is that journalists worldwide are starting to self-censor more. Sources are less inclined to speak on the record out of fear. There's a clear link between this compression of press freedom and democratic backsliding. According to the Variety of Democracies 2026 Democracy Report, which tracks 174 countries over 25 years, press freedom is the single most common first casualty of democratic decline. That said, in good news, the reverse is also true. In countries where democracy is improving, media freedom also improves with it. And we've seen interesting glimmers of this already, for example, in the aftermath of Peter Magyar's historic win in Hungary on the weekend, where one of his first statements was an intention to dismantle the state propaganda machine and give more space to independent outlets. Now, the proof will be in the pudding of what he actually does, but I found that instructive that was one of his first public utterances.
Even before you brought that up, I was going to ask you about Hungary because, this mainly because it just happened, of course, but that was a 16-year regime that quickly eroded the media's power. And, by the end of the regime, I think they had said that 80% of the media control in the country was controlled by functionally the government and its allies. How closely did you follow that, and what lessons can people who defend journalism and holding governments to account, what can we learn from that experience and how this, election results somehow overcame that?
There's a lot of really interesting lessons from the Hungarian example, both cautionary ones and inspiring ones. On the cautionary side, I remember attending a conference on hate and how to address issues of rising hate in Canada. Rachel Gilmore was one of the panelists for obvious reasons. And there was a Hungarian lawyer who was present at the conference. And in the Q&A section, I had raised this issue around disinformation and information manipulation and the ways in which Canadians are incredibly vulnerable to the kind of information manipulation that can lead to people, showing mass skepticism towards vaccines, for example, the kind of information manipulation that can lead to a sudden uptick in concern about trans bathrooms 3 years after they were introduced in the West, for example, that can lead to people thinking that Alberta separatism is a more powerful force than it actually is. This is information manipulation, and it usually it's usually a real domestic concern, but it's whipped up by disinformation actors, bots, trolls, and foreign governments working to manipulate the information that we see on our phones. And the Hungarian guy came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I'm so glad you raised that, because I live with that concern daily. We are, well into this at this point. We live in this sort of crazy, half-baked, Orbanized, Russified reality in Hungary. You guys are at the start of this, but if you don't take early action to ensure that your populations are inoculated from this kind of information manipulation through mass teaching of media literacy, media skepticism, the debunking of disinformation online from K to 12, what the Finns do, what the Estonians do, then you are incredibly vulnerable." And we've seen the impact of that kind of vulnerability in a very open society like the United States, where Finnish journalist Jessica Aro, who has been a support for our European program, has done an amazing job of documenting the ways in which Russian disinformation tools and strategies helped to deliver the 2016 election to Donald Trump, for example. Forewarned is forearmed as far as Canada is concerned. And every time I have an opportunity to, I tell decision makers, this is the national security issue of the first import, and we should be engaging in a whole of society approach to ensuring that people are inoculated from this kind of information manipulation, because it leaves us so vulnerable to foreign interference. On the positive side, what we have also seen is after 16 years of that, Hungarians were fed up. And what was very powerful in what Peter Magyar built was the focus on corruption. And that's where journalists can also play a really important role, because one thing that people understand, and Canadians certainly understand, is a situation where government and those in power are self-dealing in ways that they are enriching themselves, is something that goes against almost every norm in our society. And so focusing on the ways in which autocratic governments turn to self-enrichment can be a very powerful way to cut through some of that disinformation and deliver the kind of result that we saw this weekend.
So because you've brought up Finland and the idea of inoculation, I want to pivot a little bit earlier than I thought I was going to when I planned out my questions. But I want to talk about pre-bunking, because this is something that is, our listeners will know I bring this up constantly, but pre-bunking is something where you inoculate a population against disinformation. And a lot of disinformation is spread online, of course, and the Finns, given they border Russia, they understand how important it is to combat that. They start training kids as young as 7 to be able to recognize disinformation online, 6 years old. And they train adults too. They train their boomers. They train every generation to learn how to recognize this. And it's incredibly important. When we turn to, the online side of the battle with journalism and disinformation, it's moving so quickly, but it's also something that, years ago, you started seeing these AI videos of like Obama or whoever. And I felt very strongly then that this was going to go down a very dark road where you could make a politician say anything and it would be really, really hard for them to refute it. And what does that mean for our democracy? There's many other ways that deepfakes and all this AI disinfo can, play out online and in society. Just before I hit record, I was talking about a CBC deepfake that frequently you'll see on YouTube. Now, again, a stunning amount of our audience actually watches the podcast on their TVs on YouTube, which I, never would have expected until I saw the data, but that's where a lot of people watch it. And when you go on YouTube on your TV, you get these ads about how Mark Carney is announcing some kind of benefit of, I think it's $35,000 or whatever to Canadians. And if you just go to this QR code, click this link, it'll bring you to this site that looks shockingly like the CBC, but clearly does not have a CBC URL. But if you're not paying attention, which in this attention economy where no one's really paying attention is often the case, these things can look really real. They can dupe you very quickly, and they become a huge problem. So how can readers actually tell the difference, readers and viewers, tell the difference between investigative reporting that is actually real and done by journalists versus that something that is a computer-generated lie meant to confuse them and trick them? How I know we're getting pretty close to the point where it's really hard to tell and make that distinction, but what are the tools that you suggest people use to figure that out?
So there are a few basic things. As you say, media literacy is now a survival skill for citizens, not just journalists. And so there are some key strategies, starting with checking the original source, verifying the outlet, checking the URL. That's an important one because often the URL is just slightly off from what the original URL would be. Look for reporting elsewhere online that corroborates this news from reliable news outlets where you know that the information that you are consuming has been gathered and fact-checked and verified by human beings. I would strongly encourage everyone who listens to your pod, and I'm sure that most of your audience already does this, but subscribe to reliable news outlets. Make that part of your daily diet. Ensure that at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, you're just checking in with a group of human beings whose job it is to verify facts. Because that will serve you in great stead. Nothing is going to be more valuable as we go forward, as we're navigating this swamp of AI slop that is now online. I would also encourage those who are listening to your pod to follow Craig Silverman online. He was the journalist with BuzzFeed who coined the term fake news. He now uses all his social feeds to promote different new technology tools to help verify and fact check information online as it emerges.
Fantastic. Something else that has come out of this disinformation cesspool online is as we move increasingly online, newsrooms are shrinking and journalists are moving online to break news. There's a lot of journalists who are moving on to platforms like Substack, things like that. But as they are online more and more, it opens them up to more harassment online, which, not that journalists didn't face harassment in person or, on the pages of their news sites before, but now that they're online, it is everywhere. It is all the time. What strategies do you teach journalists to use to combat online harassment, and how far can you really actually fight back against it?
Great question. As you say, harassment is a newsroom safety issue now, not just a personal one, not just, the individual who has somehow gotten themselves in trouble. This is a systemic problem and it requires a system-wide response. First and foremost, newsrooms and newsroom leaders need to show their people that they have their back. And they can do that in a few ways, by providing personal support, by providing legal support, by ensuring that there are harassment response protocols and policies in place that are well communicated across the newsroom. JHR has been instrumental, for example, in putting such policies in place across newsrooms in both Kenya and now South Sudan. Key strategies include, for both the newsroom and the journalist in question, documenting every example of the harassment, using platform reporting tools to report the harassment and adjusting privacy settings proactively. Newsrooms can also consider legal action. Jean LaRose at APTN used this technique effectively to help shut down harassment of his on-air Indigenous female anchors, which, as you can imagine, was endemic at one point. It's also valuable, depending on the nature of the harassment, to engage police in situations where the harassment is chronic and also in situations where it appears to be motivated by a foreign government. The latter is called transnational repression, where a foreign government has decided that they've identified a journalist or a dissident whose news reporting or whose actions online they don't like, and they are trying to make that person, they're trying to silence that person's voice. York Regional Police, which police the part of the country that has one of the largest diaspora communities of Iranian Canadians, as well as the largest community of Chinese Canadians in the world. They have developed strategies for identifying and harassing transnational repression of this kind, which includes providing day-to-day support to the victim so that the victim doesn't feel like they're going crazy, which is easy to do when you're receiving these death threats or other kinds of horror online, as well as identifying the IP addresses and sending warnings to those engaging in this kind of chronic harassment, indicating that they will be charged. And this has actually led to, in some cases, stopping the harassment. So we are starting to see new strategies and tools evolve that can be effective in turning back this tide. But at the same time, as we were talking before we started the recording, law enforcement and regulation are always playing catch up with technology, and there are so many depressing examples of, in particular, female leaders or female journalists who've been hounded out of their respective choices, professions, because of this kind of cyber harassment. It is a terrible thing.
Yeah, and we could do a whole episode on the ties to like people engaging in this behavior who also engage in, vaccine skepticism, climate skepticism. These are all conversations that come up regularly on our podcast. And what a lot of those people have in common is misogyny as well, which obviously plays a big role in journalism, especially online these days. I do want to talk about something that you brought up there, which is the relationship between governments and journalists and the legal apparatus for that. So there are some governments, well, maybe all governments, since to a certain level, they have a tendency to engage in expensive lawsuits against newsrooms. And the idea here is not that necessarily they have a real legal case about the journalism that has been presented. Often it's more a case of they know they can bankrupt that newsroom before it actually comes out that this was all not actually a real thing. So how common is that practice? And perhaps that's a question of where we're talking about, but how common is that practice, and how much of a threat is that to journalism going forward?
What you're talking about is known as lawfare amongst journalism circles, and it's very widespread. It was a very, very popular tool in Orban's government, for example. Viktor Orban used this a lot to try and shut down small and medium-sized news organizations that couldn't survive the legal costs of fighting a lawsuit against the government. We just saw, happily, one of these frivolous lawsuits tossed out. The Wall Street Journal was being sued by Donald Trump for their coverage of his signature on that birthday card to Jeffrey Epstein, and the judge decided that there was no basis for the suit, and it was tossed out. The Wall Street Journal has deep pockets. Many of the smaller and medium-sized newsrooms that are targeted with this kind of lawfare can't survive the legal costs in question and would prefer either to fold or to self-censor. Understandably, given, for example, in Canada, this kind of use of, for example, okay, so we're talking about SLAPP cases, strategic lawsuits against public participation, which are designed to drain resources, not win in court. There is anti-SLAPP legislation in Canada, where it is also a growing concern, but this legislation is inconsistently applied. Anti-SLAPP costs in Canada can easily reach $100,000 or more. This is in part because the legislation has set a very high bar for the merit of the defense. Each defendant, each plaintiff has to reach an extremely high bar, which requires a lot of legal work, which then raises the costs. So many media outlets choose not to use the anti-SLAPP legislation because it creates such extreme expense and delay, and they simply let the litigation run its course, which then has the effect of tying up court proceedings with these kinds of frivolous lawsuits, whilst also chilling both the outlet in question from continuing its coverage, as well as deterring other courts from using, other news organizations from delving into the story. Editors start to second guess their stories. They decide against the coverage preemptively to avoid these kinds of lawsuits. It is worth noting, we're going to come back to technology for a second, that social media companies publishing reams of the kind of fake and libelous content that you just described are not held to these standards. This leads to a situation where news organizations, especially smaller ones, have these incentives to self-censor in the shadow of this kind of legal threat, whereas platforms can continue to publish fake information at grand scale with no such concern, including situations where platforms are enabling foreign agents to manipulate public opinion at a mass scale. I have a deep problem ethically with that, and I think your readership and your listenership should as well. It seems crazy to me that newsrooms are being held to these insanely high standards for publication, whereas platforms can publish on addictive technology this material that is objectively fake and libelous with no such concern.
I do want to pause on that for a second, because the federal government right now in Canada has put forward legislation. I think it's the Strong and Free Elections Act or something like that. They always have these names for these things, right? That are kind of meaningless. But I think one of the components of it, if I'm remembering correctly, is on disinformation and trying to clean up this ecosystem. Have you looked into this a lot? What are your thoughts on that legislation? Do you think anything's going to materially change if this legislation passes?
To be honest, I think a more effective approach. The problem is that then you get into the world of who is assessing what is objective information, and in my view, unless you have a sort of an army of objective journalists, similar to Wikipedia, unless you have an army of people whose job it is to assess, the validity of this content and determine, whether or not the content is real or fake, you run into all sorts of problems with, censorship and so on. You don't really want the government in the business of censoring news platforms, but of any kind. However, what I'm more compelled by and where I see more hope is in the kinds of legal strategies that we've seen coming out of the United States, where concerned parent groups have gotten together to show the addictive nature of these technologies and that they were designed to deliver information that was not good for their children in ways that have led to real redress coming from the companies. I'm hopeful that we will see more of that kind of activity in Canada as using the courts back against these technologies in ways that help them to be more accountable for, and where it becomes just more ruinously expensive to publish these kinds of fakes on their platforms.
Something has reached like peak saturation when I just finished reading the most recent Lincoln Lawyer book, and it was all about this topic and parental groups coming forward and trying to rein in these platforms and these AI tools and all this kind of stuff. So it's clearly top of mind for the public at large at this point if it's into popular fiction. I want to turn now to some of the work that you're doing with journalists. So Journalists for Human Rights, of course, human rights is central to that conversation, and understanding the idea that journalists can actually surface human rights issues and help to address abuses. So when you're training journalists, you train thousands of them to report on human rights safely and objectively. What does that look like? What are the survival skills that you give to journalists as they're working in countries where perhaps governments are actively trying to silence them?
Great question, and one that keeps me up at night on a regular basis. Digital security is foundational, helping journalists to understand the importance of using encrypted communications, protecting sources, device hygiene, checking their devices for hidden trackers, these kinds of techniques. We then have the first line of defense in a situation of a direct attack is professionalism. If the journalist has been trained and can show that they've done a professional job of weighing all sides of the issue and reporting on the story, that helps to diffuse charges of bias and ranting. So that's first. Second line is legal, reaching out to networks such as Journalistes en danger, or there's a Thomson Reuters, the Thompson Foundation offers these kinds of supports as well, to source legal support, as well as press freedom organizations from the Committee to Protect Journalists to Reporters Without Borders, and we work with all of these organizations. Third is networking, building up in situations where there is a union, building up the journalists' union's ability to champion and advocate for journalists, but also simply building trusted local networks so that no journalist is working in isolation, creating programs where journalists amplify facts, including online, so that there is a counterpoint to all of this AI slop. If a propaganda campaign is breaking, then journalists are showing what the facts are of the issue en masse as a group. While also publishing the sources of threats. And the latter has been very effective in places like, including very challenging environments such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, pointing out where a government or a spy agency or security services are attempting to silence journalists, and everybody in the network publicizing who's attempting to not play fair with journalists. And we found that to be a very effective strategy for helping to roll back some of the threats. Fourth, and very important, is advocating for journalist interests, both with local governments and internationally, and advocating for visas, including in this country, to help to evacuate those at particular risk. providing mental health supports to build resilience. We do a lot of that in our European programming. And our last resort is evacuation. And I'm sad to say that we've done plenty of that too, including most recently with journalists fleeing Afghanistan in the face of retribution from the Taliban. We evacuated over 500 journalists and their family members in a coalition of media and press freedom organizations, but also evacuating journalists from Congo, Mali, depending on the context, South Sudan, depending on the context and what the journalists were facing. We have been trying to evacuate some journalists in Gaza, but that has been really very, very challenging in terms of being able to then locate places where Gazan journalists can go. But it is going to be an ongoing go forward part of our work, unfortunately, because there are these kinds of threats, and in some circumstances, they do require the extreme resort of relocating the journalist from their environment to another country.
I want to talk a little bit about that because, as you mentioned, there are conflicts all over the world that need to be reported on, but often lead to journalists being pushed out of those countries, which essentially creates a situation where you have journalists in exile who still want to keep reporting on the stories that they had been reporting on, but don't have the same access that they might have had physically before, or the resources in terms of the newsroom support. There's some journalists I follow, back in my government days, I was very involved on the Ukrainian issue when Crimea was first invaded, and I've been following a lot of journalists from that time period. Some of them have lost their newsroom support and have continued to stay there on their own dime, et cetera, et cetera. Some have had to flee, et cetera, et cetera. How do you support exiled journalists in continuing to report on their communities from abroad?
It's a very important part of the work. Exile doesn't end the story, as you noted. It just changes where it's told from. And so we've helped exiled journalists find platforms to keep reporting, both here in Canada and around the world. Across Europe, we have been supporting independent Russian and Belarusian journalists to cover what is happening in their respective countries, and across Europe to both a diaspora and a home audience. And that work has been very powerful. Stories have included The Nullifiers, a series by independent Russian outlet called Kvestva, which documents, for example, the mafia state tactics of Russian army officers who demand a cut of soldiers' pay in return for keeping them off the meat grinder of the front lines in Ukraine. And this is happening in real time. That story has been picked up by The Economist, amongst other outlets. Also a documentary series by another independent Russian organization called Activatica, documenting Russian state terror against Ukrainian civilians in the occupied territories, showing how the use of Russia's use of arbitrary arrest, torture, and detention without charge in a network of secret prisons has been an important tool keeping the Ukrainian population in the occupied territories terrorized and under control. Really important that that story broke when it did in July of last year, 2025. We launched it at the European Parliament. It subsequently had showings across Europe, and we're hoping to bring it to Canada, helping people to understand what Ukrainian civilians are facing in these occupied territories as this crazy peace process continues on, where the United States is leaning on Ukraine to give up those territories. This kind of storytelling shows what that means in human terms for the Ukrainian civilians living in those places, and that's very, very important. We've also set up programs here in Canada to help journalists in exile find their feet in the news media's ecosystem here and find their voices. For example, we have a program with the Walrus that helps to amplify diverse voices in Canadian media who are journalists in exile, including Soraya Amiri of Afghanistan and Mustafa Al-Assar of Egypt. And following our initial efforts to bring Afghan journalists out of Afghanistan, we were able, working with Meta in this case, to offer paid placements, work placements over a course of a year for 10 Afghan journalists in leading Canadian newsrooms, including CTV News, the Toronto Star, the Canadian Press, the Global News, and the Hamilton Spectator. And of 10 placements, 5 are now working full-time in the news media. That was, I would argue, one of our most successful initiatives. And I would love, if anyone is listening here who would like to lean in and support that kind of initiative on a go-forward basis, we would love to talk with those people, because one of the things that is obviously challenging when you first arrive as a dissident or a journalist in exile is you don't have Canadian experience to get access access to news media and to get access to ways to publish your work. And these kinds of initiatives have been important in helping to do that. We've also helped incubate an organization called Resilient Societies, led by a very powerful Afghan-Canadian leader named Maiwand Rahab. And Resilient Societies is hoping to do more of that kind of work, helping to identify work placements for people who are coming from situations where they've been exiled from their countries due to their voices, due to their research, due to their intellectual work, due to their journalism, helping those voices to continue to tell the stories that need to be told so that the international community knows what's going on in those locations.
I want to ask a little bit about that transition for, you spoke with the journalists who came here and started working in Canadian newsrooms. What do journalists in exile need in terms of, experience, skill set, whatever, to actually be able to take on full-time work in the countries that they land in? Because I wonder about that transition. Like, we hear it all the time when we talked about, like doctors coming over to Canada and not having the right credentials. And, this credentials mismatch is always seems to be an issue. I don't necessarily know what that looks like in terms of journalism. Obviously, we have J School in Canada, and that looks a certain way. What is the gap there, and how does that get filled?
So there's obviously there's cultural barriers. There's sometimes language issues. However, what we found with, for example, that Afghan initiative, we were taking journalists who'd been reporting for years for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Al Jazeera, who had all the skills, all the language ability, the understanding of the audience, etc. And so it wasn't as challenging a situation as if we'd been working with journalists who had never worked for Western organizations. Had conversations with Nicole McIntyre, the editor of the Toronto Star, around positive uses of AI to help those journalists as well, like in a situation where there are challenges with translation and a translator can help. Obviously, that use of AI needs to be disclosed to readers, but it can help in terms of a scenario. If that's the barrier, as Nicole put it, if that was the barrier to a journalist being able to contribute in a newsroom, then she would be willing to work to put those supports in place so that journalist can do their work. There's also, really what these folks want is when they arrive, they want to be able to work and they want to be taken seriously and they want to be paid for their work. Basic things that everybody wants and needs, and their work in cases like the nullifiers program, for example, or the kind of work that Soraya has been doing on Afghanistan and Mustafa on Egypt, really helps Canadians in the international community to understand the stakes of what is going on in, for example, what gender apartheid looks like in Afghanistan. So Soraya is able to show that through her reporting, and not only help Canadians understand what it's like to live under gender apartheid, but also gives hope to the people at home because they see their issue being amplified in Canadian media and an established outlet like the Walrus. And that gives them hope that people are paying attention and that eventually there will be some kind of change.
So you've mentioned a few different countries over the course of this conversation. We've talked about Ukraine, we've talked about Afghanistan, and what those bring to mind to me is, in Ukraine, one of the big stories that journalists actually broke was about the abduction of children
Yep.
and how they were brought into Russia, which, we can talk about the genocidal implications of that because that is one of the elements of genocide that have been laid out. In Afghanistan, obviously, once other nations pulled out of that area, there was a backsliding of human rights for women. They became more repressed again. We're not allowed to be educated, things like this. And a lot of journalism has focused on that conversation. How important is journalism to uncovering the human rights abuses of women and children? And how important is it for us to tell those stories to help lead to improvements on the ground?
Fundamental. These are people who have no access to lawyers. They have no access to advocacy organizations. In many cases, they're terrified. They are under severe psychological strain. In many cases, they are experiencing a kind of Stockholm syndrome. And to be able to see their stories, their life experience reflected back in an international outlet in ways that can lead to significant action. The example of the Activatica story, after it was published, the European Union tabled a new resolution, adopted a new resolution against Russia, committing to investigate the state-sponsored use of terror against, in particular, women and children in the occupied territories. And that is something that, once the war ends, which hopefully it will soon, that becomes a legal tool to use against those Russian officers who have been operating in that way with impunity in the occupied territories. So absolutely fundamental. Now, journalists are not human rights researchers. That's not the standard that we're holding our journalists to, but their reporting can help point the way for the human rights watches and the ICC investigators to then dig in and document, case upon case of examples of the kind of human rights abuse and terror that goes on in these zones. And that, again, can lead to justice and redress for those victims eventually. So fundamental, very, 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 very important.
So perhaps one of the most important things I want to talk about today is the life and death states of journalism in the world. 2025 is one of the deadliest years on record for journalists and for the press in general. I'm actually going to read here because I want to get the numbers right. 128 journalists were killed last year. 9 out of 10 murders of journalists face no consequences, and 333 journalists remain behind bars around the world. What's led to that rise in violence and imprisonment, and what can the international community do to better protect the press?
I'm very glad you raised this. The rise in violence in part is due to the culture of impunity. It's in part due to the ways in which autocrats have denigrated and sidelined the work of the press. Authoritarian governments have learned that they can jail or kill journalists with very few real consequences in the current era and the current world disorder. According to CPJ, at least 104 of those 128 journalists you mentioned killed in 2025 died amid conflict. So in the chaos and fog of war, very few transparent investigations have been held, and no one has been held accountable legally as of yet in any of the targeted killing cases. The non-conflict toll is real too. We've seen journalists killed in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nepal, Peru, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia, where many of these journalists were deliberately targeted for reporting on corruption and crime. And we have, at the end of 2025, more than 300 journalists still in jail. So really what's important in a situation where we're faced up against so much, governments need to publicly acknowledge and condemn these journalist killings, refrain from political rhetoric that vilifies journalists, and meaningfully engage with multilateral efforts to address journalist safety, including the implementation of the UN Plan of Action steered by UNESCO. This is work that Journalists for Human Rights has supported on the ground in places like South Sudan, where we have built up a partnership with members of the Media Authority in South Sudan to champion journalists' interests. As a result of that work from 2017 on, no journalist has been killed in the course of their work in South Sudan. So it is possible to make that kind of change happen. South Sudan was a UN Plan of Action priority country for many years, basically from its founding, and now the situation is much less acute. It also looking at the establishment of an international investigative task force, which is focused on crimes against journalists, a body that could deploy resources or advise where local law enforcement lacks either capacity or political will to investigate. Support for visas. As I mentioned earlier, there is the Media Freedom Coalition that Chrystia Freeland and Jeremy Hunt got going in 2019. It's a coalition of over 50 countries, and I have on occasion been calling on that coalition to work to open up more access to visas across the coalition. So not just Canada, but across the coalition. If every country in the coalition opened up access to 10 or more visas, we would have more to work with in terms of places for journalists who are being persecuted to go. But I think the most important piece is a cultural shift, fighting back against that notion from the autocrats that journalists are somehow problematic, understanding that When journalists are being attacked and silenced in this way, it's a fundamental problem for everyone. Journalists are the eyes and ears of society. As one pollster in a conference I once attended once said, what's standing between you and a lying politician is an honest journalist. And when journalists' voices are silenced, we're all in the dark on what those governments and other authorities are doing. And there are reasons they are trying to silence those journalists that we need to know about. That's why it's so important.
There is one thing I want to talk a little bit about, and it's the slide into that environment, because something that has frustrated me about society in recent years is that people were a bit of the frog in the boiling pot of water, right? Like, people don't recognize that the little snarky comment they make online, yes, it's not the same as a journalist being targeted in a country by a government, but it is the beginning of that sliding scale. Like, these things don't happen out of nowhere. They don't happen overnight. They aren't a surprise. They are a process that begins with these small little acts that we all participate in and eventually end up somewhere really, really dark. How important is it to have that conversation? Because I feel like, as a society, I feel like we're losing our empathy, we're losing our understanding, we're losing our ability to disagree with people peacefully.
Oh.
And I don't think we're recognizing our own personal roles in letting that environment start to exist that allows for these eventual conclusions.
One of the things that I found deeply troubling in the era of this kind of corrosive online discourse is this idea that it's impossible to agree. It's impossible to disagree, to be clear, that somehow you need your tribe of people who you fully agree with online. The algorithm reinforces your deeply held conviction in your own point of view. And the minute that point of view is challenged, you cancel the other side. And there's been plenty written about cancel culture when it comes to the left. It's also a huge problem on the right. And I'm afraid that, platforms and technology promote and rewire our brains to think this way in ways that are deeply, deeply problematic for civic engagement, civil discourse, that deeply held principle of press freedom, that, I will defend to the death your right to hold a point of view that I do not share.
Yeah.
It's so important to have that in a democracy, because democracy is all about compromise and, the debate of public opinion, and the back and forth between people who have legitimate points of view that do differ. So really what I encourage is, people need to spend much less time online, because the social media algorithmic bubble is not serving them. I feel like the most sort of clear example of this is, I'm sorry to say, and I'm not a political person, but in this case, the curious behavior of the Pierre Poilievre conservatives, who seem to continually double down on their vision of the world, and seem to have abdicated their ability to read the room as a result, because they're not reading rooms that don't agree with their point of view, and that becomes an own goal.
I would argue they're not even entering those.
Some cases with the sort of the implication that somehow news media is so biased that you can't consume it. Yes, they're not even entering the room. And so to counteract a situation where you're caught in your own algorithmic bubble, start subscribing to reliable news organizations, reading them, consulting them, listening to make sure you have a steady diet of information that does on occasion challenge your point of view. It's fundamental to be able to understand that the society is made up of so many different groups with different constituencies, different agendas, and that an important part of a mature civil society is being able to hold opposing points of view in your mind at the same time, and really working to develop that civic muscle. Part of it is also attending live conversations around issues that interest you, not online, but actually going to conversations where you can be part of the discussion and where you can hear from your fellow human beings and see their humanity as they express points of view that are different from yours. Also very, very important.
That dovetails very nicely into my final question. We're going to be dropping this episode on World Press Freedom Day, and it's a good reminder. That day's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in defending world press freedom. what can our listeners do to support and defend the continued freedom of the press? And of course, our freedoms because of that freedom, both here in Canada and around the world. You've listed a few things just now, but what are some other things that regular folks can do to help solve this problem?
As I say, support with both your attention and your money reliable news organizations. Donate to organizations like Journalists for Human Rights and the Committee to Protect Journalists that do this work supporting journalists around the world. Follow reliable journalists like Craig Silverman to find out how best you can protect yourself from the kind of information manipulation that we see online. Raise this as a civic issue. Ensure that this is something that you care about and that people in government and in positions of authority understand that you want, for example, your children or your grandparents to be protected from the kind of information that manipulation that we're all exposed to by virtue of having a phone in our pockets every day. Ensuring that you understand what that kind of information manipulation can look like. When you sense that you're getting angry online, step off because there's a reason you're getting angry. You're being manipulated. Understand that manipulation can come in all forms. The Black Little Mermaid, for example, that was Russian disinformation. That was a manipulation of a culture war cleavage that blew up. I mentioned Alberta separatism, the fuss over whether or not you could walk in the forest during the forest fire season in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia last year, also massively amplified by Russian disinformation. So understanding when and where you're being manipulated and fighting back by making sure that part of your daily information diet is some information that has come from a reliable news organization that has been verified by a human being.
I can't think of a better note to end on. Thanks so much for joining me today, Rachel.
Thank you, Teresa. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.